Hello and welcome to the last segment for Module 5 on content mining and social media. As we generally do, I'll go through some announcements before we get into the material. First, regarding Assignment 3, I'm working at getting the grades for these together, and note that Assignment 4 is due next week. If you have any issues with this or concerns about Assignment 4, please reach out and let me know. I'm also working on grading the semester project data collection reports. I'll get those back to you this week. Note that the intermediate report is due at the end of this week as well. Remember, it's 1 page per student in your group, and you need to make sure that you do not have any sort of name or identifying information on the submitted PDF that you provide, because I'll be sharing those PDFs with your fellow students, and we want to keep this an anonymous, double-blinded process. And then during this week, Alvaro and Pratik should be providing us with some ethics presentations. Getting back into content mining, we've talked about content mining for different kinds of data. We spent a lot of time talking about content mining for text, and we've discussed briefly the idea of content mining for images, and then we've talked briefly about doing some mining via metadata that we can extract from our social media data. And we had a number of different motivations for content mining, trying to understand sentiment about topics, the kinds of topics that people were discussing, where were people discussing particular kinds of content, using geolocation. So as I mentioned, here we're going to focus on image mining. Some motivating questions for the image mining task, the one we've already seen, what sort of imagery gets lots of engagement, but also trying to understand what's happening on the ground. Using social media, we can extract signal or get some kind of understanding about events on the ground, even if we don't necessarily have reporters or eyes on the ground ourselves, by looking at the kinds of content, text and imagery that people are sharing. We'll talk about some examples of this at the end in terms of looking at imagery for understanding the response and aftermath of disaster. Now, the third one is what images can reveal about online behavior and the kinds of images that people share. So that you can imagine there's a lot of memes that people share that you could do image mining on. In fact, the paper by the iDrama Lab, by Sivasenato and others that I've assigned for this module has a really good example of using images that are being shared by the Russian Internet Research Agency for disinformation campaigns. When we try and answer these questions, like what kind of imagery gets a lot of engagement, there are a couple of questions we have to answer first. For instance, how do we actually extract images from our social media data? And then once we have them, how do we characterize the images that we've extracted? Well, fortunately, from an extraction standpoint, this is actually a relatively straightforward task, especially if we are using something like Twitter or Reddit. We'll have a couple of examples where you have the metadata about these tweets or these pieces of content that generally come with some information about the media embedded within them. So for a given tweet, if that tweet has a photo, you can go look at the entities field, and within entities field there's often a media field that has information about images that are shared. So here in this example we see for some tweets that have this entities and media, we get the type, we get a URL to the media, we get even information about resolution, and we can pull video information as well. And we can get more sophisticated, so if we look at the extended media information, so here if we're looking at a particular video, we can look at extended entities in our tweets and look at this array of media content, and for each one of these pieces of media content we can actually pull a media URL that we can then use to download that particular piece of media to do our own sort of analysis on the media. So here this is an example of using JQ to parse through a bunch of media and figure out what kinds of content are embedded or what kinds of media content are embedded in these social media messages. Now this may seem like a relatively esoteric thing, but here's a nice visualization that we were able to construct of the kinds of media that were shared by random Twitter users in 2015 to 2018 or so, looking at the kinds of content that were shared and then clustering them or creating this visualization where images that are close together in this graph are similar in some kind of ways. Nice clustering kind of approach. And here down at the bottom left you see examples of screenshots or text. Over towards the right you see images of people's faces, and then down in the middle you have images of animals, these kinds of things. So through this, we're able to characterize the general kinds of content that people share, but first we were able to extract these images from our social media content, specifically Twitter here. Now, if you want to understand why is this really valuable, these are a number of images that were shared in 2014 in August during the political unrest or social unrest and demonstrations around the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. So here we have a number of different social media accounts, all from Twitter, with different kinds of imagery showing different kinds of narratives about what's happening on the ground, from the Fox News image that has a very sort of militarized police feel to other examples of the use of tear gas, and the bottom one in the middle of arrests of journalists at McDonald's. By looking at this kind of content on social media or tracking these users, we can build up a visual narrative of what's happening on the ground using just social media, which is naturally very valuable for people like journalists or people who are trying to understand or tell a story about what's going on. In fact, this has generated a good amount of research in the computational social science arena, where people look at the pictures that were used or shared during protests, especially during Ferguson, to understand what was going on, how are people using these images to relay a particular narrative or story. And in fact, more recently, we've seen research from Andreu Casas and others looking at how images in general have a particularly high mobilization effect. So people are motivated by text to a certain degree, by actions on their friends, but also imagery has a particularly strong role in mobilizing people to engage in protest. But this isn't a question that we can just look at Twitter for. In fact, if you go to YouTube, you can pull thumbnails for the vast majority of videos that are posted to YouTube and do analysis on YouTube videos. You can go to Reddit and look at the push shift database and pull out thumbnails or preview images from this kind of content as well. And you can apply the same kinds of image extraction pipelines and then analysis pipelines to visual media from a number of these different platforms. This is even more valuable when we're looking at platforms like Instagram or TikTok that are generally media or visually focused by design. So that gives us some insight into being able to extract images, and for many of these things you can rank these images by the number of retweets, which we've seen we can pull out from the metadata in our tweets. So now the real question is, how do we characterize these images? How do we learn something about them? Fortunately, there's a whole field on which we can draw for understanding and characterizing images from computer vision. From a high level, a very high level, we can talk about image understanding or image characterization in the same way that we talked about characterizing text. So remember, for the text case, when we were trying to do sentiment analysis, we had some data set of documents that contained sentiment or some class that we wanted to learn. And then from these documents, we were able to apply tokenization and a number of preprocessing things, like removing stop words or lemmatization. This is reducing a token from its general word to its lemma, and creating these features using TF-IDF or some count vectorizer. We talked about these last time. And once we have these features, then we can apply some supervised machine learning model to predict our labels from these text features. So when we talk about characterizing images, we can approach this in very much the same way, where we have a data set of images, and then we want to extract some amount of features or some set of features from these images, and then use some machine learning model or some statistical method to either predict labels of these images or cluster images into useful clusters of some form. But when we talk about this, the real question is, how do we do this? So when we talk about text, we have talked about tokenizations. We take some message and we tokenize it up into its individual tokens or unigrams or bigrams or trigrams. But for images, what do we do? So we have this image here. How do we extract features from this? Well, it turns out there are many, many ways to do this. One is through color histograms here, where you look at the distribution of intensities for red, green, and blue, or whatever some particular color set you have is, primarily red and green and blue, since that's what we use for encoding imagery. You could also look for key points where you take some image and you look for points that are particularly important. This might be corners or points that change in shadow. And then you can identify or try and map these key points into some model that lets you either track these key points as an image rotates or use some matching algorithm to identify similar sets of key points or similar blobs from image to image. One particular kind of key point that is of value is as I mentioned, corners, where you can look for corners in images and use these as key points because they may tell you something about the kind of image. Or if you characterize or generalize a set of corners from a particular kind of object, you might make some claim that objects of similar kinds or objects of similar labels have similar sets of corners. So you can do this as an object detection mechanism. But an issue that you run in with corner detection, while corners can be rotated and still maintain their general shape as a corner, if you scale up an image, then you may lose this idea of a corner as the scale gets so large that whatever your window is on a particular image may be less able to identify these corners. As this image here, we have a corner that fits into one box on the left, but as you scale that corner up, then this box can't see the full corner anymore, and now we've lost some ability to identify corners. So in this corner detection task in 2003, 2004, a very popular paper came about for identifying these corners in a scale invariant way. So this is an algorithm that was named SIFT that became very popular in the image classification or object recognition field. And in fact, there are many other kinds of similar techniques for identifying these key points in some way. So OpenCV is a popular library for computer vision, similar to scikit-learn if you're doing machine learning in Python. And it has a lot of these kinds of feature matching or key point identification algorithms built into it. And you can go check many of them out from SIFT or SIRFT or a number of these other kinds of algorithms. But in the past 5 to 8 years or so, with the advent of deep learning, computer vision has changed radically. One of the major advances here is the ability to use convolutional neural networks to identify key points in a much more robust kind of way. One of the major breakthroughs in using deep learning for image classification and object detection in images was this paper on deep residual learning for image recognition that was published in 2016 at CVPR. This paper talks about a system that won the ILS-VRC 2015 classification task. This is called ResNet. And to see just how impactful this idea was, this paper has been cited over 59,000 times, which is a huge amount of citations for any paper. Now with the text mining pipelines that we talked about before, I'm not going to go into detail about how these deep learning approaches work for image classification or image analysis. There's a lot of classes for this. There's a lot of resources out there available for you. Instead, what I'll talk about is how we can use these techniques for doing tasks or for doing analysis on social media data. One in particular is using image mining for disinformation. So I've mentioned over the course of the class that we can use the kind of social media that's presented by disinformation agents or agents of disinformation campaigns, and we can learn something about how these disinformation campaigns operate. We can do the same kind of thing with image mining. It turns out that the signal of coordination that these disinformation campaigns use, it's present in their text, is also similarly present in the images that they share. One of the ways we've tried to do this is to try to compare the kinds of images that are shared by your general sort of social media user on Twitter to the images that are shared by the Internet Research Agency, which is a Russian-affiliated disinformation factory of some form. And here we can compare and see some pretty distinct differences in the kinds of imagery. So on the left, we see a subset of images shared by your average Twitter user. We see a lot of it is about, or a lot of it in this particular case, there are faces and pictures of animals, as you might expect. But on the right, we see clear focus on militaristic imagery. Now, these are just subsections of mosaics of images that are shared in these spaces, but at no point in time is there a very clear cluster of militaristic imagery to this degree present within the general sort of Twitter user audience or Twitter audience. So here there's a very distinct sort of signal that we can extract just from images. And as talked about in the Zanato paper, we can do a similar thing for memes that are shared by these kinds of organizations. Another way we've been using image mining in my research has been for understanding disaster response and the severity of particular disasters. So one of the sort of general habits that people display in the aftermath of some disaster is they use social media to post images of what they have seen or images of what they've experienced. And we've been able to use this kind of content to gauge the severity of particular events based on looking for images of damaged infrastructure or images of disaster aftermath or floods, these kinds of things. And we can learn a lot about what has happened or the amount of damage or level of severity of a particular incident by looking at the imagery that's shared in these platforms. And with that, we wrap up Module 5 on content mining. Now, as I mentioned, I won't go into detail into how these work. We've spent a lot of time on content mining. If you have questions about how we can do image analysis, or you want to try and do image analysis for one of your assignments or for part of your project, by all means reach out and we can work together about how we might do that.